Inside Canada's fortresses of fear, secrets of Millhaven and Kingston Penitentiary. The gates that never forget. They say Canada is quiet, peaceful, predictable. A place where violence happens somewhere else, far away, on flickering news feeds, in cities with impossible skylines and police sirens that never sleep. But in eastern Ontario, between the limestone shorelines of Lake Ontario and the patient silence of rural fields, there are two places that never believed in that myth. Places that swallowed men whole, erased their pasts, and locked away their futures. Places where the worst crimes Canada has ever seen were dissected, catalogued, and quarantined behind concrete. Millhaven Institution. Kingston Penitentiary. Two names so steeped in infamy that even people who have never stepped foot in Ontario know them from headlines, court transcripts, or late-night conversations whispered with a strange mix of dread and curiosity. If Canada had a Mount Rushmore of its darkest stories, these prisons would be carved into the stone. Kingston Pen, a legend born in 1835. Millhaven, the modern beast built in 1971 when Kingston Pen was supposed to shut down for good but never quite did. This story begins on a morning that looked harmless enough, clouds drifting like slow ships over the lake, the branches of old maples bending in a wind that carried no warning. But danger has a habit of being quiet in Canada. It hides behind courtesy. It sits politely behind reinforced glass until the metal doors close and the locks settle like a judge's final sentence. And on that morning, the gates of Millhaven clanged shut on a new arrival, our guide into this world. We'll call him Daniel Mercer, a pseudonym for a composite figure based on accounts reported by former corrections officers, parole board summaries, and verified public records. Daniel wasn't a guard, and he wasn't an inmate. He was something in the middle, a federal investigator assigned to conduct internal audits on high-security risk protocols, security checks that had intensified after a series of incidents involving contraband smuggling, violent assaults, and several disturbing near-escapes documented in official Correctional Service of Canada, CSC, communications. According to internal reports later cited in news coverage, Millhaven had been dealing with a spike in security anomalies, a sterile term for anything from homemade weapons to drones dropping packages into the yard. And Kingston Pen, though shuttered since 2013, still held secrets that complicated everything. Boxes of old files, evidence logs, half-preserved disciplinary records, escape blueprints, and post-riot assessments, all of it still existed, still relevant, and still influencing how Millhaven operated. Daniel's assignment. A full comparative review of historical security failures at Kingston Pen and current vulnerabilities at Millhaven, before something catastrophic happened again. As he approached the first checkpoint, Daniel felt a familiar pressure wrap around his chest. Anyone who has ever walked into a Supermax facility knows the sensation. It's not fear, not exactly. It's awareness. An instinct. Like some ancient part of the brain wakes up and whispers, every person in here has nothing to lose. The first gate slid open. Beyond it, the air changed. Millhaven's architecture was designed with one priority: eliminate illusion. Towers rise over the grounds like watchful sentinels. Razor wire coils across the sky. The concrete walls have no softness, no pretense. Of all Canada's maximum security institutions, Millhaven has a reputation for being the purest expression of what incarceration looks like when the state stops caring about comfort and focuses entirely on containment. According to archived CSC data and numerous investigative reports, the prison has housed some of Canada's most dangerous offenders, serial killers, gang leaders, terrorists, and men whose crimes haunt whole communities. It was also the site of a major inmate uprising in 1971, less than 3 months after opening, an event thoroughly documented in news reports of the era. Buildings were set ablaze, hostages were taken, and the chaos revealed how unprepared the facility had initially been. Kingston Penitentiary, on the other hand, was old enough to have lived several lives. It had seen controversies, escapes, and violent riots, most infamously in 1971, a brutal and well-documented uprising in which 2 inmates were murdered. According to public inquiries and court records, the riot exposed deep systemic issues inside the prison, leading to reforms that would ripple through the entire correctional system for decades. Daniel knew all of this. He had read the reports, studied the timelines, memorized the failures. But reading about a place and walking into it are two different experiences. The second gate opened. Inside, Millhaven breathed like a living organism. The sounds were disjointed, a sudden clang from the metal shop, a shout accelerating into an argument, the hum of fluorescent lights that never rested. This was a place where routines ruled everything. Breakfast at 7. Yard time at 10. Lockdown at, whenever the tension crested too high. A guard escorted Daniel through the administrative wing, past a row of photographs showing every warden in Millhaven's history. Their faces shifted over the decades, from stern Victorian mustaches to the clean-cut pragmatism of modern administrators. Only their eyes remained constant. Serious. Weathered. Resigned. Daniel focused on the final photograph. A warden who had served during a particularly turbulent era, one marked by gang wars, internal investigations, and several controversial use-of-force cases that had appeared in national news. According to media analysis at the time, Millhaven had become a pressure cooker, a battleground between inmate factions and a staff stretched thin. Somewhere behind Daniel, a steel door slammed. The guide motioned him forward. They approached an interview room where Daniel would begin his first assessment, reviewing archived files from Kingston Pen that had recently been transferred for audit. Even though Kingston Pen had closed long ago, its legacy remained stitched into the fabric of Canada's correctional history. The stone fortress had survived nearly 180 years of escapes, riots, executions, scandals, and reforms. It was impossible to understand Millhaven without understanding the shadow Kingston Pen still cast. When the door shut behind him, Daniel found a stack of beige file boxes waiting on the metal table. Handwritten labels. KP, Escape Attempts 1923 to 1993. KP, Incident Reports, unredacted. KP, Riot Debriefs 1954/1971. KP, Special Handling Unit Transfers. KP, High Risk Movement Logs. Only a few of these would ever be accessible to the public. Most were internal documents preserved only because bureaucracy had a habit of choking on its own paperwork. Daniel's job was to identify patterns. Weak points. Decisions that had gone wrong before and could go wrong again. He opened the first box. A cloud of dust lifted. Inside were documents so old the paper had turned the color of weak tea, escape reports from the early 20th century. According to these records, inmates at Kingston Pen had tried everything: forged work orders, stolen keys, improvised grappling hooks made from laundry line wire. Some slipped out during construction projects, others hid in delivery wagons. Most were caught. Some weren't. Yet every attempt revealed something flawed in the system, flaws that had forced security innovations over time. Kingston Pen had evolved, hardened, learned. But for every problem it solved, a new one emerged. Daniel flipped through another report. This one, from 1954. The language was clinical, but the story wasn't. An inmate, name withheld under public record rules, had nearly escaped by exploiting a maintenance route beneath the East Yard. According to the internal summary, the inmate had studied guard routines for months. He identified a blind spot between two towers, waited for a shift change, and crawled through a vent system that had been overlooked for years. The attempt failed when a guard spotted him emerging near the loading dock, covered in dust and carrying a file tool stolen from the machine shop. But it was close. Too close. Reading the report, Daniel felt a cold ripple climb up his spine. This was why he was here. Prison systems decay. Weak points reappear. The past echoes if someone forgets to listen. Another file. Another story. This time from 1971, the most violent riot in Kingston Pen's history, documented extensively in inquiries and news articles. Inmates seized control of parts of the prison for 4 days. Guards were taken hostage. Certain prisoners, those convicted of crimes other inmates considered unforgivable, were hunted. 2 were killed. Many more were beaten nearly to death. The aftermath revealed horrifying gaps in oversight and infrastructure. Daniel knew this event had changed everything: security protocols, cell inspections, staffing requirements, emergency response tactics. But something else caught his attention. A memo dated 6 months after the riot. It referenced Millhaven. The document stated, in anticipation of Kingston Penitentiary's closure, expedited construction of Millhaven Institution must address all identified weaknesses uncovered during the KP incident. Irony, Kingston Pen wouldn't close for another 40-plus years. But Millhaven, new, modern, reinforced, had inherited the ghosts of a prison that refused to die. Daniel leaned back in the chair, absorbing the weight of what he was reading. That's when the lights flickered. Not long, just a quick stutter. A blink. The guard outside didn't notice. But Daniel did. He stood, walked to the window, and scanned the corridor. Nothing unusual. Yet he remembered one of Millhaven's most common security concerns, something repeatedly mentioned in CSC reports and external audits: power grid stress. Electrical fluctuations that occasionally tripped alarms or unlocked systems that should remain locked. It wasn't frequent, but it had happened. And in maximum security prison design, anything that can happen is treated as something that will. Daniel returned to the table and opened a fresh file. But this one wasn't from Kingston Pen. It was labeled Millhaven, Internal Incident, Unredacted, Year, 2017. Immediately, his pulse shifted. This report described a situation involving drone-delivered contraband, one of the first widely recorded attempts in Canada where a drone successfully dropped a package inside a federal prison. According to news reports and CSC confirmations at the time, the payload included drugs, cell phones, and assorted illicit items. The discovery triggered a lockdown and launched a national investigation. Reading the details was like watching security evolve in real time. Old prisons faced escapes over walls. Modern prisons faced threats streaming in from the sky. Daniel closed the file slowly. He felt the story forming, even though he hadn't written a single word yet. Kingston Pen represented history. Millhaven represented danger. And somewhere between the documented past and the unpredictable present, the line between control and chaos wavered. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Mercer, right. A man appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered, mid-50s, an expression carved by years of tension. Warden's ready for you. Daniel stood, gathering his notes. The guard who had escorted him earlier returned and motioned him to follow. They walked down a corridor where every step echoed with metallic finality. To the left were observation windows into the ranges, rows of cells behind thick barriers of reinforced glass and steel. Some inmates watched with hawk-like interest. Others ignored them entirely, their minds drifting elsewhere. Daniel felt the weight of the place settle onto him again. Millhaven wasn't like other prisons. According to former staff interviews reported in media, the atmosphere was sharper, heavier. The inmates here had histories that read like cautionary tales, tragedies, and nightmares combined. Many were serving life sentences with no realistic chance of release. That changes the psychology of a place. Hope shrinks. Violence grows. When they reached the administrative wing, the guard opened a door to a spacious office lined with certificates, security maps, and a framed photo of Kingston Pen taken shortly before its closure. The warden, Angela Rhodes, another pseudonym representing a composite of publicly documented administrators, stood to greet him. Her handshake was firm. Her eyes were more tired than she wanted to admit. Mr. Mercer, she said. Thank you for coming. I know this audit wasn't supposed to happen for another 6 months. Daniel nodded. Your memo suggested urgency. It's more than urgency, Rhodes replied. It's déjà vu. She motioned to a chair, then handed him a report stamped confidential. Daniel skimmed the first page. His stomach tightened. The incident described had occurred only 2 weeks earlier. According to the summary, a high-risk inmate, name withheld, had nearly executed a coordinated escape attempt involving a compromised staff member. The plan had been discovered before it could unfold, but what chilled Daniel was the method, exploiting a blind spot between 2 towers on the perimeter. The exact same vulnerability that had existed at Kingston Pen 70 years earlier. Rhodes continued. I've worked in corrections for 30 years. I know patterns when I see them. This isn't an isolated incident. We've had increased contraband, unusual movement requests, coded communications intercepted through inmate mail. Someone is testing us. Any suspects? She exhaled. Dozens. But suspects aren't the problem. History is. Daniel knew what she meant. Prisons develop cycles. Violence breeds violence. Weakness invites exploitation. And when a facility becomes infamous, it attracts a certain gravitational pull, drawing in men who want to challenge it, conquer it, survive it. Rhodes tapped the desk lightly. You're here to help us break the cycle before it repeats. Daniel looked through the office window at the expanse of razor wire glinting in the pale light. Where do we start? He asked. She pointed to the files he carried from Kingston Pen. Start there. Everything you need to know about Millhaven's future is hidden in Kingston's past. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. The warden wasn't being poetic. She was being literal. Of all the artifacts preserved from Kingston Pen's long and turbulent life, the most telling were the post-incident analyses, documents written by people who had survived near disaster and wanted to make sure no one else repeated their mistakes. The 1971 riot report. The 1954 escape attempt. The 1990 internal corruption investigation. The 2006 security overhaul after a high-risk transfer went wrong. The 2013 closure assessments. All of them were roadmaps. Every failure left fingerprints. Daniel's job, match them to Millhaven before disaster struck. As he left the warden's office, walking back toward the interview room, he noticed something he hadn't before, a small, framed photograph on the wall showing Kingston Pen's main cell block in 1938. The tiers stacked like ribs. Rows of iron bars stained with time. A guard standing stiffly at attention. Daniel stared at it for a moment. The prison was gone. The inmates relocated. The tours now guided curious tourists through what once housed some of Canada's darkest chapters. But prisons do not vanish just because their gates close. Their lessons migrate. And sometimes, Daniel realized, they migrate into the wrong hands. As he returned to the files, the lights flickered again. This time longer. A murmur echoed down the hallway. Then a buzzer. Then a brief, hollow silence. It whispered through coded notes, subtle favors, quiet trades made in blind spots. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched the rapid movement of officers down the corridor. He could tell by their posture, upright but tense, that whatever had triggered the alarms wasn't an emergency. It was a warning. A message. He returned to the table where the thick folders waited, filled with the voices of the past. If Chapter 1 of this story lived in the rise of tension, Chapter 2 would live in something far more dangerous. Ghosts with names. He opened a folder labeled simply Kingston Pen, High Risk Archives, Profile Number 47. Inside was a case history that stopped Daniel's hand mid-page. Profile Number 47 wasn't a complete identity, confidentiality restrictions ensured that, but the outline was unmistakable. According to archived court filings, national news reports, and a series of investigative documentaries released over 2 decades, this individual, whom Daniel would refer to only as Rogan, a pseudonym representing a composite of multiple publicly documented high-risk inmates, had been housed both in Kingston Pen and later in Millhaven during a series of transfers involving special handling unit recommendations. Rogan's existence wasn't a secret, not entirely. His crimes had dominated Canadian headlines. His appeals had been reported. His name appeared in public sentencing decisions. But inside these files lay the details the public never saw: internal behavior reports, disciplinary logs, coded messages, investigation summaries into contraband routes, and psychological assessments that read less like clinical evaluations and more like warnings. Rogan had been a storm contained by walls. And the storm, Daniel realized, had once lived in Kingston Pen, before being moved to Millhaven. According to the records, the transfer had been initiated due to security disruptions, escalating tensions, and influence concerns, language that usually meant one thing: an inmate whose presence could incite unrest. Daniel flipped ahead. A line in a memorandum written by a Kingston Pen warden decades earlier struck him immediately. Rogan functions like gravity. Anything unstable begins to orbit him. That kind of influence didn't disappear simply because a prison closed. Influence migrates. Loyalties travel. Patterns resurrect. Daniel closed the folder slowly. For a moment, the buzzing light overhead felt like a second heartbeat, timing the past and present together. He thought about the warden's earlier warning: someone is testing us. Was it possible, probable even, that whatever was stirring Millhaven had roots buried deep in Kingston Pen's past? He turned to the next page. A map of Kingston Pen dated 1979, decades after the riot but long before closure, showed routes marked in red. These were movement pathways, patterns of inmate travel observed during behavioral surveillance. Rogan's routes were circled twice. He had moved across ranges he technically had no reason to be in. He had accessed workshops on days he wasn't scheduled. He had been seen speaking to inmates catalogued as non-associates. And every time a rule tightened around him, he adapted. Daniel felt a chill. In maximum security environments, inmates with this kind of adaptability always left legacies, philosophies, tactics, hidden scripts passed on like contraband wisdom. Sometimes they traveled through gangs. Sometimes through friendships. Sometimes through simple observation. But they traveled. And what travels, returns. Outside the interview room, the footsteps had slowed. Guards were settling back into position. The hum of the fluorescent light steadied. Daniel returned to another box. Inside was a file from 2013. The year Kingston Pen closed. The year everything changed. He pulled out a transcript labeled Final Transfer Summary, KP to Millhaven, internal use only. The narrative was straightforward. As Kingston Pen prepared for decommissioning, high-risk inmates were relocated. Some went to Millhaven. Some to other institutions. But a specific subset, those classified as institutionally influential, were flagged for enhanced observation during and after transfer. Rogan, again using the composite pseudonym, was on that list. According to publicly available reporting at the time, the closure was chaotic. Staff struggled to relocate decades of files. Some records were digitized, others were boxed for later review. It was a moment of vulnerability, a moment where long-held secrets risked exposure and long-buried tensions were uprooted. Daniel read the note attached to Rogan's profile. Ensure transfer does not coincide with movement of any known affiliates. Avoid clustering. Prevent re-establishment of influence networks at destination institution. He exhaled slowly. If those precautions had failed, even slightly, Millhaven may have inherited more than inmates during the closure. It may have inherited a culture. A silent, strategic philosophy born in a stone fortress nearly 2 centuries old. He set the box aside and pulled open another. This one contained a report Daniel hadn't seen before. CSC Internal Audit, Staff Integrity Review, 2018. Partially publicly referenced in national investigative journalism. The report documented several incidents across multiple institutions, but the Millhaven entry stood out. According to the audit, there had been signals of staff compromise, unexplained absences, irregular access logs, inconsistent surveillance footage retention. Daniel read. No conclusive evidence of corruption was established. However, patterns are consistent with known indicators of staff manipulation. It was the next line that froze him. Influence patterns similar to those historically associated with inmate networks originating in Kingston Pen. There it was again. Kingston. The contagion. The shadow that refused to die. As Daniel sifted through pages, a question formed, quiet, obvious, impossible to ignore. Had someone inside Millhaven resurrected a decades-old network once controlled by a man who walked out of Kingston Pen? He didn't know. Not yet. But the pieces were shifting. He reviewed a disciplinary log from Millhaven dated 4 years earlier. It referenced coded communications found in an inmate's property. The content, partially decoded, contained references to blueprints, angles, blind towers, the old way, north wall weakness, and one final phrase underlined twice. KP doctrine. Daniel felt the temperature in the room drop. Doctrines don't emerge spontaneously in prisons. They are taught, passed down, protected. And if someone inside Millhaven was circulating old Kingston Pen knowledge, the kind of strategic, long-study information accrued by inmates with decades behind bars, then this wasn't a random anomaly. This was a revival. A resurrection of a playbook that had once nearly burned a prison to the ground. A chill settled over him. This was no longer an audit. This was an autopsy. Performed on 2 institutions, one alive and one dead, whose histories were bleeding into each other. The guard at the door knocked once. "You good in here?" he asked. Daniel nodded. His voice felt caught in his throat. The guard leaned against the frame. Lockdown was nothing. 2 inmates testing boundaries. Happens more often lately. More often? Daniel asked. The guard hesitated. Depends who you ask. Ask you. The guard shifted his weight. Feels like the place is unsettled. Guys moving like they know something's coming. Like they're waiting for someone to make the first move. Daniel thought of the Kingston Pen riot documents. Every riot had a preface, quiet movements, coded alliances, sudden calm before an explosion. Any idea why? Daniel asked. The guard smirked, but not with humor. Because Millhaven's changing. We used to be the end of the line. The last stop. But lately. Feels like we're the sequel to something that never ended. Daniel's pulse spiked. The guard left. Daniel returned to the files. A folder labeled simply, Behavioral Patterns, Influence Networks, contained several diagrams mapping inmate associations. Some connections were thick, the sign of strong hierarchical leadership. Others were dotted lines, weaker bonds, shifting alliances, or unconfirmed interactions. But one symbol appeared repeatedly. A circle with a line through it. A mark used to denote historical influence, meaning patterns that could be traced back years or decades. The legend at the bottom identified it as Legacy Influence, KP. So it wasn't just one inmate. It wasn't just one network. It was a generational inheritance. A strategic lineage. Millhaven didn't just inherit Kingston Pen's inmates. It inherited its culture of rebellion. Its knowledge of blind spots. Its memory of riots. Escapes. Power struggles. And for the first time in the entire investigation, Daniel felt something unexpected. Fear. Not the panic kind. The knowing kind. The kind that forms when the puzzle pieces stop looking like coincidence and start looking like intention. He turned back to Rogan's file. A footnote from a Kingston Pen psychologist decades earlier jumped out. If isolated influence does not diminish, it adapts. It transfers through proximity. It becomes an idea, not a man. An idea. A doctrine. A blueprint for manipulation, rebellion, and survival. Daniel rubbed his temples. He wondered if anyone else at Millhaven understood what he was uncovering, not the surface-level anomalies, but the deep structural echoes of a prison whose ghost still walked. He returned to the 1971 Kingston Pen riot documents. He read through first-hand accounts from guards, official inquiries, and publicly archived testimonies. Patterns emerged. Leaders hiding messages in plain sight. Blind spots between towers. Contraband smuggled through compromised staff. Tension rising quietly before erupting violently. Strategic manipulation of weaker inmates. Use of old architectural vulnerabilities. Silence before storm. Every one of those patterns had resurfaced, at least partially, in Millhaven's recent incident logs. Daniel flipped a page. A historical note from an investigator after the Kingston Pen riot read. The uprising was not spontaneous. It was orchestrated through micromovements. Each small rule bend was a test. Each test was a seed. The riot was simply the harvest. Daniel swallowed hard. Millhaven was full of seeds. Unsettled ranges. Coordinated movements. Contraband spikes. Subtle staff compromises. Echoes of old KP tactics. It wasn't one incident. It was a season. And seasons do not change on their own. He moved on to the next document, a Millhaven intelligence briefing from 2 years earlier. Increasing incidents of inmate-to-inmate communication referencing old ways, original codes, and KP structure. Interpretation unclear. Not unclear anymore, Daniel thought. He turned the page. A handwritten note fell out, dated years ago but unsigned. Everything old becomes new again. Watch the ones who talk the least. Below it, a second line. The doctrine survives when the institution forgets. Daniel stared at the note for almost a full minute. Then he reached for another Kingston Pen box. This one was different, smaller, heavier, with a label suggesting it contained documents used for training purposes in a now-defunct internal course taught to new correctional staff decades earlier. Inside were photocopies of case studies. One was titled, "The Invisible Leadership Model, KP Analysis, 1960 to 1975. It described inmates who never yelled, never fought openly, never stirred chaos with noise. These were the orchestrators. The strategists. The ones who manipulated through silence and observation." Daniel knew what that meant for Millhaven. The loud inmates weren't the problem. The quiet ones were. He continued reading. A subheading read, "Architects of Influence, How High-Risk Offenders Create Independent Networks Across Transfers." Daniel froze. That meant the network didn't need one leader. It didn't need one mastermind. It could sustain itself through fragments, pieces of an old ideology carried in pockets like smuggled contraband. He flipped pages feverishly now. Another heading. Dual institution contagion, when one prison inherits the problems of another. Daniel felt heat rise in his chest. The case study described a real incident from the 1980s where a group of inmates transferred from Kingston Pen had integrated into another maximum security facility and, within a year, reorganized local power structures based on their original hierarchy. It remained one of the most studied examples of institutional culture transfer within CSC, referenced multiple times in academic research and corrections conferences. The final line of the study read, "When you move a high-risk inmate, you move more than a body. You move their philosophy." A knock cracked through the silence. Daniel looked up. Warden Rhodes stepped into the room. Her expression was unreadable. "We need to talk," she said. He nodded slowly. "You saw the lockdown report?" She shook her head. "This is bigger." She placed a tablet on the table and tapped the screen. A video loaded, a grainy surveillance clip from a yard camera. The timestamp was from that morning, not long before Daniel arrived. The footage showed a group of inmates walking in a formation that didn't look casual. They weren't speaking. But their spacing, their synchronized movements, it resembled something Daniel had seen once before, in a training video analyzing Kingston Pen riot precursors. He leaned in. "This was minutes before the lockdown," Rhodes said. "We were reviewing footage after an officer flagged unusual communication between two ranges." Daniel studied the screen. The formation changed. An inmate paused, stooped down to tie a shoe, and another cut across the yard at the same moment, blocking a guard's line of sight to a third inmate who slipped a folded piece of paper into his waistband. Subtle. Calculated. Coordinated. Exactly like the 1971 Kingston Pen precursor footage. Exactly like the 1954 escape rehearsal documented in internal reports. Exactly like the influence networks described in Rogan's file. Rhodes watched Daniel's reaction. "You're seeing it too, aren't you?" she said. Daniel nodded. "This isn't new behavior," he said. "It's inherited behavior." Rhodes closed her eyes, just for a moment. Then she inhaled sharply. "Then we need to know what they're planning and how far it's spread." Daniel rose from the table. "We start with the KP archives," he said. "Every incident. Every escape attempt. Every coded communication. If they're replicating something, we'll find the blueprint." Rhodes nodded. "And then," she asked. Daniel picked up Rogan's file. "Then," he said quietly, "we find out who's learned from the ghost of Kingston Pen." The warden stared at him. Then she whispered the words neither of them wanted to say aloud. Before they repeat it. Outside, Millhaven's walls loomed like a fortress refusing to blink, unaware, or perhaps very aware, that its most dangerous threat wasn't coming from outside. It was rising from its own history. Living in the blind spots. Breathing in the routines. Moving in silence. Just like Rogan once had. Just like Kingston Pen once had. And as Daniel stepped back into the hallway, he realized the truth. The blueprint of breaking points. The next morning arrived the way tension does in prisons, without ceremony, without sound, without warning. Just a shift in temperature. A different rhythm in the footsteps outside the cell blocks. A silence where noise should be. It was the kind of morning that correctional officers described in interviews years later, The kind where something felt off the second I walked through the gate. Daniel Mercer knew that feeling now. He felt it before he even opened his eyes. He had slept inside the staff residence, Millhaven's temporary lodging for investigators and auditors who needed to work late. The building wasn't luxurious. It wasn't meant to be. But it existed for mornings like this, when you didn't want to commute from Kingston or Napanee or any of the small rural towns that surrounded these concrete fortresses. He dressed quickly, mind replaying the surveillance footage the warden had shown him, those calculated movements in the yard, the coded exchange, the eerie synchronicity that echoed Kingston Pen's darkest archives. What unsettled him most wasn't the footage itself. It was the silence afterward. The lack of debrief chatter. The absence of speculation. The fact that officers avoided talking about it. Millhaven was full of noise. But inside the noise lived pockets of stillness, pockets created deliberately, Daniel realized, cultivated over time by inmates who knew that silence was often more strategic than chaos. He stepped outside into cold air that bit like unfinished metal. A low fog hovered over the ground, thin as breath but heavy enough to swallow the prison's edges. The razor wire was dew-slick and glinting under the early light. The watchtowers felt closer, somehow taller than the day before. Daniel reminded himself of a line he'd read in an old CSC training manual. In maximum security environments, atmospheres shift before events do. Today, the atmosphere had shifted. As he approached the main gate, a correctional officer he hadn't seen before scanned his badge. The officer's expression was neutral, almost too neutral. Something about the way he stood, too stiff, too controlled, made Daniel's instincts tighten. "You're the auditor?" the officer asked. "Internal investigator," Daniel replied. The officer nodded once. "Good luck in there." It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't hostility. It was something else, something more like warning. Inside the gatehouse, a group of guards murmured among themselves. Their tones were low, clipped. Daniel caught fragments. Another signal. Not coincidence. KP playbook. That last phrase twisted Daniel's stomach. Employees weren't supposed to talk like that. The Kingston Pen influence theory wasn't official. Nothing had been confirmed. And yet, here it was, whispered among staff like a superstition. Daniel continued toward the administrative wing. As he passed Range 5, he noticed an unusual sight. 2 inmates standing at their cell doors, silent, just watching. Not speaking. Not yelling. Just watching him. Their eyes didn't track the guards. They tracked him. Daniel felt heat rise at the back of his neck. He entered the office where the KP archives had been secured overnight. Inside, the boxes waited like old ghosts eager to speak. The room smelled faintly of dust and ink, the scent of decades-old secrets. Warden Rhodes arrived moments later. Her usual composed demeanor carried a thin crack. "We had another anomaly last night," she said. Daniel braced. "What kind?" "Communications." Rhodes placed a binder on the table. 3 separate letters intercepted during routine mail screening. None from the same inmate. None in the same range. But each referenced the same phrase. She opened the binder. 4 words, handwritten in prison script, appeared in each sample. "The doctrine awakens." Daniel stared at them. "That's not coincidence," he said. "No," Rhodes agreed. "It isn't." She handed him another report. "Cell extractions were performed on 2 inmates," Rhodes continued. "We found coded symbols on the underside of their desks. Circles. Lines. Marks that match KP intelligence drawings from the 1980s. Daniel's breath caught. "What do they mean?" he asked. "That's what you're here to find out." He turned back to the boxes, feeling as though he had opened a vault in Kingston Pen and unleashed something long dormant. He began reading. Not quickly, methodically. 1 page at a time, just as investigators had done decades earlier. The first file came from Kingston Pen's Special Handling Unit assessments. The SHU was a place reserved for inmates deemed too dangerous, too manipulative, or too influential for the general population. According to public documentation, only the most high-risk individuals were ever housed there. A note in the file read, Influence networks are never destroyed, only disrupted. When scattered across institutions, they evolve. Daniel underlined the sentence. Another file detailed an incident from the early 2000s at Kingston Pen involving a clandestine hierarchy among inmates. According to reporting from that period, the group organized itself not by violence but by strategy, creating a sort of clandestine council that mediated disputes, controlled contraband distribution, and influenced weaker inmates through debt, protection, or coercion. Daniel flipped ahead. A line jumped out. Members operate through signals and movements rather than direct confrontation. He exhaled. Exactly what he'd seen in Millhaven's yard footage. He continued reading. Council influence persists even after members are transferred. Behavior spreads like echo patterns. Another note, in the margin, written by an unknown staff member decades earlier. It isn't a gang. It's a method. Daniel sat back, stunned. A method can survive transfers. A gang might die with its leader. A doctrine survives without one. And Millhaven. Millhaven had inherited the doctrine. He reached for a file labeled KP, Doctrinal Communication Methods, Unverified Notes. The folder contained photocopies of handwritten diagrams seized during a Kingston Pen cell search in the 1990s. Though portions were redacted, the surviving content showed a startling structure: arrows connecting symbols, circles representing influence hubs, lines marking pathways. It wasn't a map of a prison. It was a map of behavior. A blueprint for manipulation, control, and strategic disruption. A blueprint that could be replicated anywhere. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He flipped through the diagrams, recognizing patterns similar to those noted in recent Millhaven reports. Blind spots between towers. Timed movements during yard walks. Signal gestures disguised as routine motions. Silences used as pressure tools. Indirect influence to avoid detection. All patterns that had appeared in Millhaven recently. Rhodes stepped closer. What are you seeing? Daniel pointed to one of the diagrams. This symbol, he said, tracing a circle with a line through it, has shown up in the Millhaven coded messages. Rhodes leaned in. Is it a gang marking? She asked. No, Daniel said slowly. This is older. This is something that predates the gang structures we're familiar with today. He pointed to a caption under the diagram. This was part of the KP doctrine, an organizational symbol for coordination networks. You're telling me inmates today are using symbols from the 1990s? Rhodes asked. No, Daniel corrected. I'm telling you they're using symbols created decades earlier and passed down so many times that no one even knows their origin. Rhodes stared at the diagram. How far back does this go? She asked. Daniel swallowed. Possibly to the 1950s. She didn't speak for a moment. Finally, she said, this can't be coincidence. Daniel agreed. A knock interrupted them. A correctional officer entered holding a sealed envelope. This just came through screening, he said. Addressed to an inmate on Range 2. Flagged for irregular markings. Daniel took the envelope. The exterior showed a small, crude symbol. A circle. A single diagonal slash. The same symbol from the KP archives. The same symbol found carved in 2 inmates' desks. The same symbol referenced in recent coded messages. Rhodes exhaled sharply. We need to open it. Daniel carefully sliced the envelope. Inside was a single piece of lined paper, torn from a standard commissary notebook. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate. The message was short. It begins at the wall. Before the transfer. Before the towers change. Rhodes tensed. Transfer, she repeated. What transfer? Daniel's eyes widened. What towers? He asked. Rhodes took out her phone and dialed quickly. This is Rhodes. I need confirmation on all active transfers scheduled this week. Yes, emergency confirmation. She waited, listening. Her face drained. She lowered the phone slowly. We have a high-risk transfer coming through Millhaven this Friday, she said. From another facility. He'll be moved through our intake unit for processing. Daniel felt something cold crawl down his spine. Who? He asked. Rhodes hesitated. Someone with documented KP connections. A known associate of historical networks from the old days. Daniel didn't blink. Rogan? He asked. Rhodes stared at him, stunned at the speed of his deduction. No, she whispered. Not Rogan. But someone who once answered to him. Daniel's stomach nodded. A successor. A carrier of the doctrine. She continued. He was young back then. Just a foot soldier. But after KP closed, after the transfers, after the networks fractured, he kept resurfacing in other institutions, always quietly pulling strings. What's his name? Daniel asked. Rhodes shook her head. Redacted from internal movement logs. Only the transfer code is available. She flipped through a file she carried, then read. SH 12-07. Daniel recognized the code. It indicated a special handling transfer, one of the highest risk categories in Canadian federal corrections, documented publicly in CSC literature. Why is he being sent through Millhaven? Daniel demanded. Routing change, Rhodes said. Temporary. A staffing shortage at the original destination. Daniel closed his eyes. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a scheduling fluke. This was alignment. The coded messages. The yard movements. The echoes of KP doctrine. The sudden rise in inmate coordination. The envelope warning. The arrival of a legacy figure tied to Kingston Pen's historical influence networks. It all pointed to one thing. Something was planned for the transfer. Tell me everything about this inmate, Daniel said. Rhodes shook her head again. I can't. Not until we dig up the full profile. Daniel turned back to the KP archives. Then we find it, he said. If he was part of a KP influence network, his name, or the pseudonym used to refer to him, will be in these files. They work through the morning, cross-referencing symbols, matching movement logs, comparing handwriting samples, tracing association patterns across decades of documentation. Finally, Daniel found a note. Apprentice to profile number 47. The pseudonym used for Rogan. The apprentice's coded designation was The Echo. Daniel whispered the word aloud. Rhodes froze. That's the transfer code name used internally for a high-risk inmate, she said. He's the one coming Friday. The Echo. A successor. A student of the doctrine. Someone who learned from Kingston Pen's most dangerous tacticians. Daniel read the profile summary. Operates through influence, silence, and strategic manipulation. Known for coordinated group behavior. Documented familiarity with KP blind spot architecture and movement patterns. Rhodes paced, eyes widening with each line he read. Finally, she said what neither wanted to voice. If the doctrine is awakening, he may be the one awakening it. Daniel closed the folder. We need to stop this, he said. Rhodes nodded. But before we can stop it, we need to understand it. Not the rumors. Not the fragments. The whole thing. The full doctrine. Daniel pointed to the remaining KP boxes. Then we go deeper, he said. She nodded. We go to the beginning. They opened the oldest file in the room. A file dating back to the early 1950s, barely legible, faded with age, full of handwritten notes by officers long dead. It contained the first documented traces of the doctrine. Born in a stone fortress. Forged in silence. Passed down through decades. Resurrected in Millhaven. And as Daniel read the first lines, the room seemed to shrink around him. The doctrine begins with the wall. Not to climb it. To break what guards it. Daniel closed his eyes. Everything was coming together. Everything was pointing to something much larger than inmate coordination. Something organized. Something inherited. Something ready to activate the moment the Echo walked through Millhaven's gates. Daniel opened his eyes. We don't have much time, he said. Rhodes nodded gravely. No, she said. We don't. And in the cold, echoing silence of Millhaven Institution, a place built to contain Canada's most dangerous men. Both of them realized the same terrifying truth. The real threat wasn't an inmate. It was a doctrine. And doctrines don't die. They wait. The transfer that rewrote the walls. The day before the transfer moved through Millhaven, the prison breathed a different kind of air. A thicker air. A watchful one. The kind that made veteran correctional officers walk a little slower, look a little longer, and trust their instincts more than their job descriptions. Daniel Mercer felt it as soon as he stepped onto the internal walkway that connected the administrative wing to the secured corridors. The concrete seemed more resonant, as if the walls were absorbing sound instead of reflecting it. Even the fluorescent lights hummed differently, higher pitched, sharper, like a blade being honed. Warden Rhodes joined him as they approached the central command post. She carried a file thicker than the ones they'd reviewed the previous day. Her face was calm, but not from confidence. It was the calm of someone who knew the stakes and had already accepted how narrow the margin for error had become. Overnight? Daniel asked. She nodded. More anomalies. What kind? Her answer came in pieces, each more alarming than the last. 3 separate units reported synchronized disturbances. Minor. Nothing overt. But each happened within the same 10-minute window. What kind of disturbances? Lights flickering on one range. Modified meal line on another. 2 inmates asking for medical attention, non-urgent complaints, but timed too precisely. Daniel inhaled slowly. Synchronized. Yes. He didn't need a file to explain what that meant. Synchronized disturbances were rarely spontaneous. They were probes. Tests. Distractions meant to measure staff response time, pattern behavior, and surveillance coverage. Classic KP doctrine. Rhodes continued walking, her boots whispering across the concrete. The Echo's transfer is at 0900 hours tomorrow. He'll be routed through intake, processed through security level verification, and escorted to the Special Handling Transition Unit. She paused. That's assuming nothing interferes. Daniel knew better than to accept assumptions. The internal CSC records they'd reviewed describing historical transfers from Kingston Pen were explicit. High-risk transfers are most vulnerable at the point of transition. Meaning? Not at the originating facility. Not at the destination. But in the middle, during the movement, the escort, the transportation, the handoff. And Millhaven was tomorrow's middle. As they entered the command post, a correctional officer handed Rhodes a printed report. She scanned it briefly, frowned, then handed it to Daniel. It read. Unusual inmate movements, range 3, 2217. 3 inmates positioned at cell doors simultaneously for 12 seconds. No communication observed. Daniel felt his gut tighten. The doctrine's oldest strategy wasn't violence. It was stillness. Waiting. Watching. A synchrony that unnerved staff before they even understood why. Rhodes lowered her voice. The Echo knows he's being transferred. That's expected. But how would inmates here know the timing, the route, the window? Daniel didn't hesitate. Information leak. Or a contact. She agreed silently. They approached a metal door leading to the intelligence office. Inside, the air smelled like stale coffee and printer toner, the scent of late nights spent analyzing patterns that refused to clarify themselves. A tactical sergeant stood near a whiteboard covered in diagrams, arrows, photographs, and time-stamped entries. Daniel immediately recognized the layout, a timeline of the last 72 hours. Across the board, certain markings were circled in red. Each represented an anomaly. Each had a notation. KP parallel. Daniel stepped closer. Every circled incident, every flicker, every timed movement, every coded mark, mirrored historical activity from Kingston Pen. The sergeant handed him another file. Recovered this during a cell search this morning. He opened it. Inside were several pages torn from a notebook. Lines, circles, arrows, unfamiliar symbols, yet disturbingly reminiscent of the KP doctrine diagrams. At the bottom of the final page was a phrase. The wall is not an obstacle. It is a signal. Daniel stared at the sentence. Rhodes spoke quietly. What does that mean? He traced the words with his eyes, remembering an old handwritten annotation in the earliest KP files. In the doctrine, Daniel said, the wall isn't something to escape over. It represents system pressure. When the wall signals, it means the institution is entering a state of tension. A critical stage. You're saying Millhaven is the wall? Yes, Daniel said. And it's signaling. Before Rhodes could respond, a loud buzz filled the office. An alert. A communications officer called out from behind a console. Warden, we've got an attempted call from intake, line dropped before authentication. We monitor those lines, Rhodes said sharply. Was it internal? No, the officer said. External. Daniel exchanged a look with Rhodes. External communication reaching intake before a high-risk transfer was one of the oldest red flags in correctional security. Trace it, Rhodes ordered. We're trying, the officer said. Line bounced. Meaning? Someone didn't want to be traced. Rhodes turned to Daniel. The doctrine isn't just awakening, it's responding. Daniel nodded. Which meant something worse. Someone inside Millhaven had already begun preparing. They left the command post and headed toward intake. The hallway was quieter than usual. Too quiet. On a normal day, you heard distant echoes of inmates shouting, doors clanging, the steady rhythm of institutional life. Today, those sounds were muted, swallowed by tension. As they approached the intake unit, Daniel noticed small details. A guard looked over his shoulder more than necessary. Conversations dropped to whispers. An inmate on a hospital stretcher stared with an expression too knowing. A maintenance worker paused, pretending to adjust a panel while watching them. Every tiny detail catalogued itself in Daniel's mind. When they entered intake, the supervisor stood waiting. Morning, he said, but his tone lacked its usual ease. We're doing enhanced checks ahead of tomorrow. Good, Rhodes said. Any anomalies? The supervisor hesitated. That alone was alarming. There's something you need to see. They followed him into a small interview room where a clear evidence bag sat on the table. Inside was a torn scrap of cloth, likely from a prison-issue shirt. Marked on the cloth in pencil was a crude symbol. A circle. A diagonal slash. And, something new, 2 small dots near the circle's edge. Daniel's breath hitched. The supervisor handed him a note. We found that in the intake search area. And this taped under a bench. Daniel read the note. The arrival completes the circle. 2 dots. Not 1. 2. The doctrine symbol had evolved. Rhodes looked at Daniel. Meaning. He swallowed. Meaning the network inside Millhaven is not just waiting for the echo. It's creating a new structure. 2 dots usually indicate dual nodal points, 2 influence centers working in tandem. Rhodes stiffened. We only identified one, the upcoming transfer. Daniel shook his head. There's another. They both fell into a heavy silence. Another leader. Another node. Already inside Millhaven. Someone who had the trust of the inmate population. Someone who could coordinate symbols, scripts, signals. Someone who had learned the doctrine long before Daniel ever opened the KP archives. Rhodes took a step back, pressing her fingers to her forehead. We need to identify him. Daniel knew it wouldn't be easy. Historical doctrine networks thrived on 2 features. Invisibility and redundancy, no single point of failure. If one leader fell, another rose. He turned back to the table, opening every document he could reach. Reports, maps, behavioral analyses, transcripts. The supervisor watched with a mixture of curiosity and dread, as if waiting for a truth he didn't want to hear spoken aloud. Daniel flipped through recent behavioral logs. Nothing. Nothing. More nothing. Then, something. A name. One he'd skimmed before but not connected. A pseudonym noted in several disciplinary files. The listener. An inmate known for calm demeanor, few infractions, and a long sentence originating from another federal institution. According to publicly documented sentencing summaries and subsequent reporting, he had been involved in organized criminal activity but had maintained a reputation for de-escalation. Too clean. Too quiet. Too positioned. Daniel's pulse quickened. The listener, he said. He's our second node. Rhodes frowned. He's been low risk for years. That's exactly why he's perfect, Daniel said. He's invisible to staff. But he's everywhere to inmates. He opened a behavioral report. There it was. Multiple references to the listener being present during minor conflicts. Present during inmate-led mediations. Present during times when disturbances de-escalated too quickly. Another page referenced him casually walking the yard, always in silent proximity to different groups. Then, the final confirmation. A note from a guard dated 6 weeks earlier. Inmate increasingly approached by others for advice. Appears to defuse tensions. Harmless. Harmless. The most dangerous label anyone could assign to a strategist. Rhodes spoke slowly. Why would he want the echo brought here? He must know this will destabilize everything. Daniel shook his head. He doesn't want chaos. Then what does he want? Daniel pointed to the symbol on the cloth, the circle, slash, and 2 dots. He wants to unite the doctrine. 2 nodes. 1 inside. 1 arriving. Rhodes clenched her jaw. A reunion. Not just that, Daniel said. A consolidation of influence. She took a long breath. We need to isolate the listener immediately. No, Daniel said quickly. If he realizes he's exposed, he'll trigger a distraction. Maybe a riot. Maybe something worse. Then what do we do? Rhodes asked. Daniel spoke the answer he wished he didn't know. We watch. We wait. And we prepare for the transfer to be the ignition point. Rhodes didn't argue. Because she knew. Millhaven wasn't facing a riot. It wasn't facing an escape attempt. It wasn't facing a single inmate. It was facing an ideology. A doctrinal lineage passed down from Kingston Pen. A philosophy of manipulation honed over decades. A network of silent strategists. And tomorrow morning, the echo would arrive. They spent the rest of the day planning for contingencies. Enhanced surveillance. Secure escort protocols. Additional officers on the intake unit. Metal detectors recalibrated. Communication lines secured. Auxiliary emergency teams stationed at every blind spot. Everything was tightened. Everything except the one variable they couldn't control. The inmates. Night fell slowly, casting long shadows across Millhaven's walls. The prison lights buzzed in the darkness, carving out bright circles across the yard like interrogation spots. Tower guards paced their platforms with measured steps. But somewhere deep inside the cell blocks, inmates moved differently. Quieter. More deliberate. Like they were waiting for something promised long ago. Daniel reviewed the final KP file before leaving for the night. A handwritten note by a long-retired Kingston Pen investigator read. A doctrine is not merely a plan. It is an inheritance. It ripens over time. The most dangerous moment is not the uprising. It is the moment before. When silence becomes agreement. Daniel closed the file. Silence. Millhaven was full of it tonight. He stepped outside, lifting his gaze to the sky. The stars were faint, obscured by the glow of security lights. The towers stood like sentinels unwilling to sleep. Rhodes joined him. You should rest, she said. Daniel didn't respond. Tomorrow won't be simple, she added. No, Daniel said quietly. Tomorrow will be the day everything Kingston Pen left behind finally wakes up. She looked at him, hearing the weight behind his words. Do you think we can stop it? She asked. Daniel didn't answer. Because the truth was simple. Stopping a riot was possible. Stopping an escape was possible. Stopping a single inmate was possible. But stopping a doctrine. Stopping an idea designed to survive destruction. Stopping a philosophy carried forward by men who no longer needed to communicate loudly to coordinate. That was something else. That depends, Daniel finally said. On what? Rhodes asked. On whether the doctrine is already complete. She inhaled sharply. And if it is? Daniel looked at Millhaven's walls, cold, massive, resolute. Then tomorrow, he said, the wall signals again. And with that, the night crept deeper around them, heavy with a silence that felt more like preparation than peace. Inside Millhaven, inmates lay in their bunks, eyes open, listening to something unspoken passing through the air. An old rhythm. An old order. An inheritance from stone walls 150 kilometers away. A doctrine born in Kingston Pen. A doctrine resurrected in Millhaven. And tomorrow, when the transfer vehicle rolled through the gate, the doctrine would not just awaken. It would step into the light. Ready. Complete. And looking for its moment.